With the war over, Tunner's flyers went to work bringing POWs and other American internees out of what had been Japanese territory, while continuing to bring in supplies and administration. Tunner considered going into business with Hap Arnold, setting up a cargo airline using military surplus transports, but decided instead to stay in the service. He took a desk job at the Pentagon and became deputy commander of the newly formed Military Air Transportation Service, fusing the transport capabilities of the Air Force and Navy into one. In Europe, what had been a power-sharing agreement between allies had turned into a face-off between new enemies. The Soviets on one side of the line were open in their desire to dominate Europe. The Americans, British, and French on the other were committed to preventing that domination. On June 19, 1948, the Soviet commanding general in Berlin referred to Berlin as part of the Soviet occupation zone. The next day, the Soviets began tearing up railroad tracks and building blockades to make that statement real. Behind closed doors, President Truman's military advisors advocated sending an armored column to break the blockade. Diplomats inquired whether Great Britain would allow the United States to base nuclear-armed aircraft in England and launch strikes against Eastern Europe from English soil. Berlin had 30 days' supply of food and fuel, at which point the United States would have to either fight or surrender. To give Truman more time, the Air Force started flying essential materials into the city. The city needed 7,500 tons of supplies a day, including coal to fire its electrical generators. Under Curtis LeMay, the airlift built to 2,500 tons a day, a frantic pace that seemed unsustainable. There were no schedules, no standard procedures, none of the tools Tunner had used to build the capacity of the Hump Air Force during World War II. With the clock ticking down to a nuclear confrontation between East and West, the lessons of India and China seemed to have been forgotten. A month after the airlift started, the Air Force ordered Tunner to Berlin. His job this time? Give President Truman all the time he needed to prevent a nuclear war. Tunner reassembled as much of his World War II team as he could and set off to confront a new set of problems. Not only did he have to supply a whole city, he had to do it through only 2 airports in Berlin. When the Berlin airlift started, there was no one who believed that it would be possible to supply all of Berlin's needs by air. When General William Tunner and his staff arrived, they quickly assessed the situation and went to work. Willie the Whip revised procedures at the only 2 air bases open to Western aircraft, Tempelhof, the American base, and Britain's Gatow. Crews, which had previously lounged around the ready room while their planes were unloaded, were ordered to stay with their planes and take off the instant they were ready to go. Tunner noted that the distance to Berlin from the British sector of Germany was shorter than from the American, and moved as much of the loading operation as possible to British bases. That alone increased by nearly 50% the number of runs the planes could make. In August, bad weather stacked planes up in the very limited airspace over Berlin. Tunner, who was on one of the transports, watched as air traffic managers lost control of the situation. One plane skidded off a runway and crashed. Another landed on a runway under construction and ground looped. Up in the clouds, planes had to veer to avoid mid-air collisions. Disgusted, Tunner got on the radio and ordered everyone back to their home bases, and instituted a policy giving planes only a single pass at landing. If they couldn't, they went home fully loaded, but the planes coming behind them had safe skies into the runway. From all over the world, Tunner requisitioned and received C-54s, the largest transports running at the time. His command celebrated Air Force Day in September the way they had celebrated Armed Forces Day in India, by organizing a record-setting day of incredibly hard work. The airlift that had seemed chaotic, moving 2,000 tons a day in July, moved 7,000 on September 18th, and averaged almost 5,000 by October. Tunner announced the construction of a new airport in Berlin and began hauling materials to build it. The first plane landed there in November. It was fully operational a month later. In the background, negotiations between the Soviets and the United States continued. Nuclear-armed B-29s were moved to England within striking distance of targets in the Soviet Union. Plans were drawn up for an invasion of East Germany. What kept the nuclear trigger from being pulled was, without question, Tunner's airlift. It made clear to the Soviets that America's hand could not be forced. With the whole world watching, Stalin was unwilling to start shooting American planes out of the sky. As the blockade dragged on, Tunner put on another of his fantastic shows, an Easter Sunday orgy of transport that moved almost 13,000 tons of supplies into the supposedly cut-off Berlin. The Easter Parade, as Tunner called it, broke the Soviet will, and a month later, they ended the blockade. Tunner's team had flown more than 250,000 supply sorties. Tunner received the Distinguished Service Medal. He and his men were named Aviation Men of the Year by the Air Force Association.